Hello and welcome once again to Context. I'm Enrico Wilford. On this program, we try to put in context all the happenings that are going on in the country, the current happenings, and those particularly today deal with what has been happening today. The president met with the leader of the opposition, and of course there were discussions, and coming out of those discussions, we have with us the Prime Minister and the Minister of State, Minister Joe Harmon. Prime Minister Moses Nagamootoo, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Minister Harmon, welcome to the program of Context.
Thank you.
We keep talking about what is happening in the country. Bring us up to date as to what happened today. Minister Harmon, you want to begin?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Enrico. Let me put this in context. As you'll recall that there was a vote in the National Assembly on the 21st of December. After that vote, the leader of the opposition approached me to request a meeting with His Excellency the President. The President responded to him in writing, indicating that when he returned from Cuba, he was going to set a specific date, time, and place when that meeting was going to take place. So the date, time, and place was today at 11 o'clock at the Ministry of the Presidency. And so what was held there was a high-level bilateral meeting between the government and the opposition. The government team was, of course, led by His Excellency, President David Granger, and included the Honorable Prime Minister, Vice President Carl Greenwich, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Vice President Kemrad Ramjatan, the Minister of Public Security, the Attorney General, Mr. Basil Williams, the Minister of Natural Resources, Mr. Raphael Trotman, the Minister of Social Protection, Ms. Amna Ali, and myself. That was the government delegation. The leader of the opposition's delegation included Mr. Anil Nandlal, Mr. Irfan Ali, Dr. Frank Anthony, Ms. Gail Teixeira, Mr. Odinga Lumumba, the Bishop Juan Edgil, and Ms. Pauline Sukai. Those were the representatives. The meeting, in our view, was conducted in a very cordial manner. We believe that it was important enough for us to understand that what was important here was what was in the national interest. And so our side proposed an agenda, certain items on the agenda for discussion. As you recall, in my letter to the leader of the opposition for this meeting, I had asked that he identify the issues which he wishes to have dealt with. And in his letter, he said he wanted to deal with elections and that he had an open mind in relation to any other issues. So the government team proposed an agenda which included two major areas. One was constitutional and legal situation, and the other one, of course, general and regional elections. As subsets of the first limb, that is the constitutional legal situation, we dealt with the functioning of the National Assembly, the function of the government, public services, public order, and the dissolution of Parliament. On the general and regional elections, we dealt with the role of the National Assembly, the operational readiness of GCOM, national registration, and public information. We felt that these were important issues and recognized first and foremost, and we made it very clear that the government was elected and that it had a mandate to govern and that there was no limitation placed in the Constitution on the right of the government to govern. And so we wanted to make that point very clear to the meeting very early up. There were several other issues which were discussed, but I'll ask the Prime Minister to take it from here, and I will deal with the other issues as they become necessary. Thank you.
Prime Minister?
Thank you, Enrico. And I think Minister Harmon has set out the framework within which this meeting was held. I can tell you this, that it has been a very fruitful, constructive meeting. And I must commend both the government and the opposition sides, particularly the president and the leader of the opposition. I've seen, and you don't see this very often, but I've been around long enough, the display of marvelous maturity and calm equanimity by the leaders dealing with a situation that holds so grave implications for Guyana. And I believe that what has come out today is an affirmation by the national leaders that irrespective of what happens in this country politically, they are both committed with their parties to the protection of the sovereignty of our country, to the protection of our territorial integrity, that no country could look at what is happening in Guyana at the moment or since December 21st and use that as an opportunity to weaken our country and threaten our sovereignty. And so for everything else I could put aside, that today was a triumph of a commitment to patriotism, a commitment to national values. And so I would rate the meeting, the bilateral meeting, as very successful in this context. Some might have said that this today would have been a meeting between the warlords. Well, that didn't happen. I think more or less it was the opposite. It was meeting of the peacemakers, of two sides that have their own priorities and their own issues. Some may be very controversial issues, but they're committed to the national interest. And I stressed at one point that the two sides, the leader of the opposition came in and said that he came with an open mind. And the president of Guyana, President Granger, said that, listen, we have our challenges and we have some difficult moments, but we must look at the opportunities which have been presented to us as an open door for us to enter into discussions and dialogue and areas of our national life that perhaps we had never entered before. So in that regard, I think that the specific issues that Minister Harmon has dealt with, they are going to be contained in a communique that both sides have ventilated their views. What comes out of the communique is that you see that the opposition say, this is my concern, the opposition leader or the opposition side. The government responded to say, this is how we look at it. And in the end, it says, we are committed to the Constitution of this country, which is a supreme law, that nothing should be done to undermine the Constitution. Nothing should be done to interfere with the stability of Guyana, to the peace and the order of our country. Nothing should be done to interrupt the delivery of services to our people, whether those services are regular or emergency services. They will continue. And what came out of the meeting is that the two parties are going to commit themselves to pursue certain matters, like jointly to go to the Elections Commission to find out what would be the Elections Commission's priorities and programs. They would explore that. In the meantime, I think there is a recognition that the Parliament must continue, and inside the Parliament, there would be potential for the parties to work together to deal with time frames in which things could be done. today I've seen great hope that the opposition and the government can focus without being contentious, without being argumentative, without being even controversial, in a sense that we see controversy in Guyana tend to be hostile, that you could sit and you could dialogue. And I said at the time when the vote was taken on the no confidence motion, I said that, you know, that the opposition has to consider that it has now bought itself a seat at the table. And that table has to be the table of negotiation, the table of dialogue, the table of mutual cooperation for the good of Guyana. We are facing a future for our country that was undreamt of just a few years ago. It could change every single thing about our country, the way our economy develops, the way our society progresses, the future for our children and our grandchildren, and certainly the role of political parties within that new framework. So that you are not now dealing simply with parties looking at power per se. You're looking at a dynamic that say we may have to work together. Right now we have some challenges. We are focusing on those challenges. We have different approaches to them, but it's not going to prevent us from talking. So for me, the takeaway of today's meeting is that the government and the opposition are both committed to a constructive path of resolving the issues that we have hanging over Guyana at this point in time like a dark shadow. And we hope we can dispel that dark shadow as we enter into more engagements.
So it wasn't a case of people sticking to their positions. It was moving towards maturity in the public interest and in the public, for the public good, was it?
No, they state their position. Each side state their position. The opposition would have said, for instance, that the government should resign. The government position is that, look, you can't create a vacuum. You don't have a situation where the government should rise. And they dealt with the legal, the constitutional matters, and also point out that, look, while we acknowledge what has happened in the legislature, there is the doctrine of the separation of power. You have the legislature, you have the executive, you have the judiciary. The judiciary has now been engaged in an exercise. You can't dictate to the judiciary. You can't give the judiciary orders. The judiciary may take what is called notice of what the parties are themselves doing, and that itself will tell the judiciary that, listen, there are issues that must be dealt with in an expeditious way, but we should not interfere, we should not stop, and what people say, we cannot oust the jurisdiction of the court if the court is engaged in the issue dealing with a specific aspect of the controversy that has led to this no confidence motion being accepted in the National Assembly, subject to the review by the Speaker, who said he'd like the court to pronounce on the matters, which he had said left him in a state of doubt. So we should not in any way stop those processes from taking place. But what I said earlier, that there was a maturity that was shown, was that even within all these areas of problems and concern, the parties have met and they have not come out with their sword in their hand. They came out with a shield of protection, that we want to protect our nation. Let's tread on all the issues. But in the end of the day, we have our individual position, but we are not going to war over these positions right now. We will see how the process develops. So it's a good day for Guyana today, the 9th of January.
Minister Harmon, you said at the opening of the program that the government made it clear that the government has been elected and therefore has the right to govern. And therefore, many people on the streets and so on, I just came in and again, a guy was asking me, you know, what's happening? What's happening? Is the president still the president? Is, you know, what's happening?
Yes, indeed. In fact, you'd recall that there was a sort of a a voice which became a louder voice that said, okay, after this no confidence motion, the government should resign. I believe now that more mature deliberation has taken place, that more persons are coming to the view, which we hold, that the government remains in office, the president remains the president, until such time that there is a new election. So there is no issue about the government resigning. So we just want to put that to rest. And this was a point that we made very clear to the opposition this morning in the meeting. And I think they appreciate that you cannot have a vacuum in government, that there always has to be a government. Secondly, on the basis of the proper interpretation of what the consequences of a vote means, and looking at two articles of the Constitution, even taken together or taken separately, would mean that there always has to be a government in office. Now, the point which also was made by the government side was that there are matters which have been placed in the domain of the court. And that while we recognize the judiciary is independent and that the processes in the court will have to run its course, it was clearly our intention to see that this process can be completed expeditiously. I say that because of two things. One, it is that we feel that there is a very strong case in the court. And two, on the second limb, we believe that whatever time is called for these elections, that we will be ready for them. And so this is how we went into that mindset into the meeting, that said there's nothing that the government is afraid of. We are not afraid of early elections. We are not afraid of what the court will determine. Either way, we are prepared to accept a final ruling of the court, and we have submitted ourselves to the jurisdiction of the court, as well as the final status, which is in fact our Constitution. So we have always said that we respect the Constitution as our supreme law, and we respect the rulings of our courts. This is something that since we came into office, we've always respected court rulings, and we never budge from that. So this is our position still. But even saying that, what we're saying is that if, for example, the court were to rule in a certain manner, that we will be prepared to take the steps that are necessary to go to an election. So I've seen already some statements made about we saying elections will be in 2019 and all of that. I think that what the process which we have engaged in today basically looks at the thing at two levels. One, as I said, the constitutional and legal limb, which will require certain things to be done. And then, of course, it is the operational readiness of the Elections Commission to be able to determine the issues before it. It has to do, of course, also with registration issues, whether there has to be a completely new registration or it can be a different type of registration. But certainly registration issues will become important. But these are matters which the two persons who have been identified by the government, Minister Amna Ali, and on the lead side of the opposition, Ms. Gail Teixeira, that they will engage the Elections Commission to inquire as to their operational readiness and not so much to go into any operational details about it, but they will brief them about those things. Additionally, we have asked the Honorable Minister of Legal Affairs, an AG, Mr. Basil Williams, to meet with Mr. Anil Nandlal to look at ways in which the parties can examine the matters that are before the court to see how best they can assist the court to bring these matters to a conclusion very quickly. So these are the two tracks on which we're traveling. And I want to say that, like the Prime Minister, that we are committed to the Constitution, we are committed to the rule of law, and that we will abide by that. But at the same time, we want to ensure that and make it very clear that it is our responsibility as a government to provide order, good order, to provide services, public services to the society, including a serious security operation that ensures that people feel secured, and there is not this question of people feeling that, okay, something is happening and they're not too sure about what is happening. We hope that this meeting today will bring clarity to these matters, and so that people understand, the country understands that the government is the government remains as the central authority, and that the government will ensure that the laws of this country are respected.
You're in the program Context, and we are examining the developments coming out of the meeting between the leader of the opposition and his delegation and the president of Guyana and his delegation today, the 9th of January. You've been hearing from the Minister of State, Minister Joe Harmon, and the Prime Minister, Moses Nagamootoo. Gentlemen, in Guyana, we seem to always, whenever we have an issue, we seem to always have experts, you know. And this is a matter that has affected the legislature, affected the executive, and affected the judiciary. But the chatter is in the Fourth Estate. And the Prime Minister, you have dealt with the Fourth Estate. You've been part of it. What could we say to the Fourth Estate, well, that brings clarity to some of these matters, in addition to what you've already said?
Well, let me put it this way. I've seen on the 22nd of December, the headlines in two of the paper, identical headlines, government has fallen. Well, that's what was in the newspapers, right? The government has not fallen. You can't have a government in place and a government has fallen. A motion was deemed as having been passed in the National Assembly. And now that matter, the Speaker reviewed it on January 3rd and said, look, I have some doubts here. And I can tell the Fourth Estate that they should look at replays in cricket. And when you see the game and someone take a catch behind the stumps, and the umpire hand goes up, and then the batsman look back and he signal and he wants a review. So they go to the third umpire. You see what they do? They show the slow motion. They show that the ball is bowled. They ascertain that there was no ball. Then they show the ball going to the bat, and they put on the sound, and they see if any motion, if the ball touches the bat, and then it gets into the wicketkeeper hand. You do the sound, and you look out for that little click. And then at the end of it, you may be satisfied that the batsman was not out after you have a review. So what happened in the Parliament was, yes, it appears as if you bowled out the government, all right? But then you have the third umpire, the court, the Speaker look at it and says, I have some doubt here, but I'll keep this thing as it is, but send it up to the third umpire, who is the court. So the court is doing a review. So what I'm saying to the Fourth Estate, don't run ahead of the story. Don't preempt what is taking place and introduce language that the government has fallen, there is no government. If there is no government in the country, there is anarchy, lawlessness. What seems to happen today is both the government and the opposition accept that there is a government in place. There is a president, there is a prime minister, there is a cabinet, and that work is going on. But they have some issues that have to be trashed out. So I want that the rhetoric should be toned down. This rush to judgment that the government must resign, ministers must leave their offices, and so on, is not, these are not helpful to Guyana. In the Caribbean, people say they are fed up with Guyana. And I want to tell leaders in the Caribbean and those who are led to believe that something is happening that is irreversible, something tragic is happening in Guyana that can bring harm to the region, that there are no bases for those fears. There was an incident in the Parliament. There was I will say, an event in the National Assembly that is now subjected to a review. And in the meantime, the parties are discussing and talking about how best these matters could be brought to a conclusion. We are open, as Minister of State Harmon has said, that we are not afraid of elections. I mean, I can speak for myself. I have faced 11 elections in my life. In the last 55 years. I stopped counting the years now. So I'm not going to be afraid of the 12th if I have to go to the polls. I'm a very seasoned runner, a thoroughbred, I used to say. But that's me personally. So elections don't scare us, and we are not denying the possibility that you could have elections down the course, down the road. Constitutionally, these are due in 2020, but you cannot shorten the processes by which these things kick in. So I want now, I saw from today's meeting, and I was looking at the opposition sitting on the other side, and I saw that there was calm and there was perspective, and on the government side, there was this, I would say, not accommodating feature. The government dealt with the issue in a very flexible way. It was not dogmatic on any issue. The president exercised skill and statesmanship and leadership. And I think that Guyanese now, looking out for what took place at the meeting, when you would have seen the communique, you would see a reflection on both sides of statesmanship and leadership. And that is good for Guyana, that we have this discussion today. And I can say down the line, if it continues in this way, it's going to open other doors, and we will see some of the things we have been dreaming for decades that may not have been possible in our country. We may see a new Guyana emerging, a new governance. And let me say this in conclusion on this point, that the issues that are engaging the public's attention in the public domain and the courts, the issue of citizenship, the issue of what constitutes a majority to pass a vote of confidence in the National Assembly. These are issues that are ripe for constitutional reform discussion. And so if there has been no necessity for constitutional reform, the matter that had happened on the 21st of December in the National Assembly indicate that constitutional reform has to take priority. And I hope that we can move in that direction, and that the parties can move not so much about the issues, the contentious issue as to whether there should be early election or late election, should set up the mechanism, the constitutional infrastructure as to what will produce the best results for the democratic will of the Guyanese people to be exercised. Surely it is unacceptable for people to go to the poll and have one person to vote in the National Assembly and derail the democratic will of the Guyanese people. So that has to be looked at. So what is coming out are some very good possibilities that we will move into a political culture that is more engaging and less confrontational, and we will have more tendency towards cooperation rather than tendencies towards conflict.
Both of you seem excited that there's this maturity going on in the society. But again, coming out of a shop, man said, well, I could still get a birth certificate. You know, so Minister Harmon, you pointed out with regard to public security, national interest, public services, all these things are still ongoing.
Indeed, they are still ongoing. And in fact, those public services have to be provided irrespective of where we are. Birth certificates have got to be produced. Citizens have a right to have these documents. But let me get back to this point about the rhetoric. The Prime Minister spoke about toning down the rhetoric. This is one of the areas that we also had some kind of agreement on, that both sides will do their best to ensure that the sort of vitriolic type of statements that are made, that we tone that down. And in many cases, sometimes it is not just the political leadership that's engaged in that kind of rhetoric, but the people at the other levels, and that we basically agree that that was necessary, that this kind of rhetoric about doom and gloom be toned down in the national interest. I think that's important. And when the Prime Minister was speaking about the fourth estate, I believe too that particularly the print media, I think they need to tone it down a little bit. They need to tone it down a little bit, because it is from these statements that persons in the region and in the wider Caribbean and in the diaspora, that they actually feed it into these statements and are allowing people to form opinions about what is happening here in Guyana. I always take this view that there are some people who only read headlines. And so if your headlines are screaming some things, but when you actually get to the article itself, it is something different. But many persons will not take the time to go to the meat of the article, because they just take the headlines and they run with it. And sometimes that, if you have headlines that are screaming things that are not really accurate, you can do a disservice to your country. So I believe that this is something that maybe the editors of our dailies and the newspapers that are online, that I believe that the meeting today would have actually set a tone for them. Because this was, like the Prime Minister said, I believe it was an excellent meeting, right? Because there was, both sides made their positions very clear, but it was done in an atmosphere of respectability and cordiality. And so even coming out of that meeting, the two sides agreed on having a joint statement. Now that statement, two persons were identified on the opposition side, Mr. Irfan Ali and Mr. Anil Nandalal, and on the government side, Minister Trotman and myself. And working on the minutes was twice as long as the meeting itself. Just trying to put together to ensure that we accurately represent what was the expressed view, and in some cases what might have been in the contemplation of the parties when we met. Now these minutes have got, of course, to be approved by both sides, and once that has been done, the statement, sorry, then we can release that to the public. So what we are talking about here are matters which would have been in the body of that statement, but the official statement will come out later on in the evening when both parties have signed on to it.
Enrico, if you allow me kindly to add quickly, the fourth estate, we're dealing with the media, would include social media. And we see on Facebook all kind of scurrilous allegations, fake news, invented news, all, and base language, lewd language, dirty language being descended too. I want to take this opportunity that when our country goes through a period of distress, it is not helpful if there are others, if they have views, not helpful to intone these views with ethnicity, with racism, with attacks against leaders and persons and so on. They have to stop the name calling and deal with the issues. They are complex issues, so that no amount of cussing down is going to help. So I want to appeal to social media operatives that they have to be very measured, very responsible, because we are facing a situation at best that could have social disorder, and you don't want to go there. And also, I believe that the print media, since people read the headlines, one day you see a headline that the MP that was sworn in, Barbara Pilgrim, was a foreign citizen. Now, the next day she made a statement and corrected that. And you would have expected that the same newspaper that screamed, new MP is an American citizen or something like that, would have carried a headline proportionate to the wrong that was done. You can't just carry somewhere inside the paper and hide it away and said, MP deny being a foreign citizen, when the day before you said MP is a foreign citizen. It is opportunistic and it is clumsy journalism, dishonest, to resort to this cheap kind of propaganda that is politically motivated and call it journalism. I want us to be responsible, and I think today we have seen this measured behavior at a conference between the government and the opposition. This is the highest leadership in the land, representing electorally almost 99% of the people of this country, the electorate of this country. And they saw the necessity to come together as an obligation to the national duty of showing the Guyanese people that they could resolve their issue as all civilizations, great civilizations would do, peacefully, perhaps not amicably at the moment, but cordially and constructively. And I believe that today's meeting would be part of the landmark development for our new politics and our new governance in Guyana.
We've got just about 2 minutes left, gentlemen, and I think at this stage we could look at what has happened in Guyana and how the international organization or international partners are looking at it. Each individual, Minister Harmon, give us a minute on what you think we should be saying to the international partners and Prime Minister.
Okay, what I think we should be saying to them is that Guyana has a maturing democracy that today represent a certain level of maturity in our political system that is something that we should cherish and we should try to develop. We should let it grow. We have committed ourselves to future meetings, to more dialogue. And so that going forward, where there are issues that affect the national interest, we have committed, the President has said, I will keep myself and my team available even at short notice to meet on matters in the national interest. And I think that that's very, very important. And this is something that the world must know, that while we may have our differences politically, that this is really a maturing of our democracy. This is really looking at the way in which our own people see us and in which the world sees us, that Guyana has a democracy which would allow for the leader of the opposition and his delegation to meet with the president and his ministers and can have an outcome that caters to the national interest in every regard. The opening statement by the Prime Minister about the fact that we have committed to ensure that any aspect with respect to our territorial integrity and sovereignty, that we are one on that no one can get in between there. So I think this is a clear statement for all the world to understand that do not think that because there's a little issue in the domestic politics that you can seek to take advantage of that to affect our national interest.
Prime Minister, the last word.
Well, look, we are a member of the Commonwealth of Nations, and we came out of a tradition of great democracies. And nothing that is happening in Guyana should send any signal to anyone in the Commonwealth and the rest of the world that it is not part and parcel of a healthy political process. And it has been contemplated within our Constitution that you could have motions of no confidence, and you could have these debated, and you can have reviews in the court. Even today, we are reading in Australia and New Zealand, the issue of citizenship has led to the resignation of several ministers, of deputy prime minister, and some members of the National Assembly. Recently, we saw the debate in the British House of Commons in relation to confidence in the government. And so all these things are happening in democracies. What is not acceptable is that you could procure votes in the National Assembly or try to unseat a government by practices that are not honest, that question the integrity of the House, that may constitute a breach of the privilege of the House for any member to dishonestly exercise the privilege of the House. That is what the Commonwealth doesn't accept. And so it's not going to be different in Guyana if we question the behavior of our elected members of the House, whether or not they have exercised their duty to the best of their ability, and they did so without fear or favor. So the legal process will take place. The investigative, if there are issues that the police and security forces have to deal with, they will continue to deal with those issues. If there are matters of extraterritorial, meaning foreign in interest, they will be addressed. And we are trying as best as we can, even through this, Enrico, your context program, to reach out to Guyanese, to be able to assure them that your state is in safe hand. The country is moving apace with its development program, and we are committed to serving our people as best as we could for the mandate which the government has received from our Guyanese people. So that we want on all sides that no one should blow these matters out of proportion. No one has a right to go out there. I mean, I'm not saying right, but it's not, I believe, the best of all options to go out there and try to triumphalism, and try to breed an atmosphere of dissension and distrust in the society. We need cooperation, we need calm, and most of all, what we saw today's meeting, we need constructive engagement for the advancement of our country.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister Moses Nagamootoo and the Minister of State, Joe Harmon, for coming on Context today to explain the outcome of the meeting between the Leader of the Opposition and the President and his delegation at the Ministry of the Presidency. This has been Context. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Enrico Wilford. Have a pleasant rest of the day. Goodbye for now.